I have great respect for the German soldiers. In reality, the Germans are the only decent people living in Europe. It is precisely because of such out-of-context sentences from former United States four-star General George Smith Patton, Jr. that many Germans are convinced of his noble, pro-German character. But he definitely did not say that during the Second World War, quite the opposite. Nevertheless, when studying the biography of the most famous American general of the Second World War, one must once again realize that nothing in a war is simply black or white. Nothing is purely good or evil. General George Patton was a general who could only have been produced by a war. He was a man of contradictions who put his foot in it more than once. To put it politely and mildly, overall, his brash, sometimes even boorish manner was not suitable for the Army of the Democratic United States of America, which, moreover, had taken the leading role in an alliance against Germany consisting of very different structures and motives. Whether it was Patton slapping two soldiers suffering from post-traumatic stress in Sicily in August 1943, an incident that was even reported on in detail by the Nazi press, his vulgar speeches about how to treat the German enemy, his primitive anti-Semitism, his shameless urinating in front of his soldiers in the ranks in March 1945 to demonstrate his contempt for the Germans in this way as well, and in particular, his orders to murder Italian and German prisoners of war. For example, as happened during the Biscari massacre in July and August 1943 in Sicily, and the massacre at Chinon during the German Ardennes offensive on January 1, 1945, with at least 80 dead. In stark contrast to his otherwise cultivated lifestyle, he was a cavalier at heart. Let's take an explanatory look at the war crimes committed in Italy. On July 14, 1943, a United States unit from the 180th Infantry Regiment of the 45th Infantry Division from South City, Oklahoma, captured the Italian airfield San Pietro and shot 74 Italian and 2 German prisoners of war there. The company commander responsible for this, Captain John T. Compton, here is an excerpt from the indictment, had been charged but was acquitted and transferred to another regiment, in which he was killed in action in Italy on November 8, 1943. Compton testified in the trial, just as German soldiers did in similar cases. He stated that he had merely followed the orders of his highest superior. For him, it was General Patton. He, during the preparations for the invasion of Sicily in North Africa, had called upon the officers of the 45th Infantry Division in a speech, quote, to show no mercy and not to accept the surrender of enemies who continued to fight at close range. And another soldier had testified, the more prisoners we take, the more we have to feed them, so it's better not to bother with prisoners at all. For the legal assessment, I quote from the book Hitler's Last General, written by the 2 British historians Ian Sayer and Douglas Botting, that if the legal principles used to convict SS troops for the massacre of American prisoners of war at Malmedy had been applied to the Biscari murders, Pepin would have been sentenced to life imprisonment and his superior, Oma Bradley, to 10 years. And Colonel Forrest Cookson, who had commanded the 180th Infantry Regiment until October 8, 1943, would have been sentenced to death. The particularly trigger-happy Sergeant Horace T. West, who boasted of having personally shot 150 Krauts, was also charged. He received life imprisonment and was demoted. However, in November 1944, on the orders of General Eisenhower, he was reinstated to active duty as a private and honorably discharged in January 1945. And regarding the massacre at Xenon, which mainly involved German medics and wounded, I will quote Wikipedia. The events were kept secret and covered up at the time. In contrast to the Malmedy massacre, none of the United States soldiers involved were charged or held legally accountable. The massacre is said to have been based on orders from higher authorities to take no prisoners as a matter of principle. If you now want to learn more about the first decades of George Smith Patton Jr., who was born in 1885, his birthplace was the suburb of Los Angeles, San Gabriel. He participated as a modern pentathlete in the 1912 Olympic Games in Stockholm, and as a lieutenant in 1916 in the punitive expedition of United States forces under General Pershing against the most prominent general of the Mexican Revolution, Francisco Pancho. Villa Patton's service as a tank commander in the First World War. His time from the end of 1942 as a commander in Tunisia. As the commander-in-chief of the 7th Army during the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, and from January 1944 as the commander of the powerful 3rd United States Army, which was deployed in France from June. You can find more than enough about this on the internet. In contrast, I want to focus more on General Patton from the German perspective, and not forget the private person George Patton. However, it must be noted that, especially in his case, he himself contributed to acquiring the image of a Hollywood celebrity. Through the books written about him and the movies made about him, and of course also because of the circumstances of his death, which for some people are still mysterious even today. A great deal, has been interpreted into his actions and inactions, as has been done with all the military leaders of the Second World War, and continues to be done to this day. And one must be careful when using historical assessments of Patton by historians, for various reasons, including positive or negative criticism, and even personal animosities, a very significant role that we could have played. So, let's go to May 8, 1945. Hardly had the unconditional surrender of the German Wehrmacht ended World War II in Europe, when the military governor of the United States occupation zone, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, appointed the most successful United States general and commander of the Third Army up to that point, George Patton, as the military governor of Bavaria on May 9. He resided in Munich in the barracks named after United States Corporal Francis Xavier McGraw, who had fallen in the Battle of Hürtgen Forest, which had previously served as the Reichszeugmeisterei. The reason for Patton's removal as troop commander was that he had loudly proclaimed in public that, after having eliminated one dictatorship in Europe, it was now time to deal with the other, which was at least just as dangerous. He was referring to the Soviet Union, an opinion that, as is well known, was also shared by Winston Churchill. But this was opposed by the political will of the United States government, which at that time was still under the spell of a strange enthusiasm. Of the United States President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who died on April 12, 1945, toward the communist dictator Joseph Stalin. Of all American generals, Patton was considered the most, let's say, German, at least in terms of his operational leadership. For him, war meant destroying the enemy's forces, not, for example, conquering and holding territory. Here is the 2-year journey of his army, from Tunisia through Sicily, the Italian mainland, France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany, all the way to Pilsen. Whenever the trained cavalryman Patton could, he tried to achieve victory by attacking the flanks. So first, to tie down the enemy with the front units, and then to smash him over the flanks with concentrated tank forces, which he saw as the modern cavalry. He was not a fan of lengthy and time-consuming analyses, which he saw as paralyzing any operation. A good plan, executed violently today, is better than a perfect plan next week. Patton had carefully studied the early so-called blitzkriegs of the Wehrmacht against Poland and France, and shared the assessment of the German military leadership. that only a short and sharply conducted war of movement was the only way to prevent a repetition of the endless slaughter in the trench and positional warfare of the First World War. His motto was, "Always stay offensive, never dig in." Of course, he didn't mean the infantryman and his motto, "Sweat saves blood," but rather the United States Army procedure, instead of always keeping large units on the move, first equipping them with every conceivable material and equipment before an attack. Patton impressively demonstrated his dislike for overly perfect defensive positions during the 1943 Tunisia campaign. After the commander of the 1st Infantry Division, Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen, on the left in the picture, showed him a beautifully constructed trench meant for protection against air raids, Patton simply urinated in it? He sarcastically told Allen, "Now you can use it." In addition to studying and visiting ancient battlefields, Patton, who believed in reincarnation, and was convinced that he could have been a commander in Napoleon's army who died in battle, or a Roman legionary in a previous life. He also studied German military literature that had been translated into English after World War I, such as the memoirs of the Chief of Staff of the 11th German Army, Hans von Seeckt, and Leadership in Battle by Adolf von Schell. The result was that Patton led his army according to the German concept of mission-type tactics. Never tell people how to do something. Tell them what to do, and they will surprise you with their ingenuity. However, Patton's intensive study of German leadership principles did not mean that German counterintelligence, that is, military intelligence or the German military leadership, regarded him as the most outstanding of the Allied generals. For them, that was the man who would later be called the architect of the Allied victory, 5-star General George C. Marshall, the namesake of the Marshall Plan. Serious for Europe after the war, or just a perception? In the middle is British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, and to his right is United States General Omar Bradley, both of whom were able to make strategic decisions at their level. Not to mention Eisenhower, who is standing to the left of them. Instead, the Germans had judged Patton in the close context of other tank commanders as a skilled tactical commander, but also not just as someone who carried out the operational plans of others. The German general of the infantry, Günther Blumentritt, characterized him this way. "We regarded Gerhard Patton as the most aggressive tank general. His operations greatly impressed us, probably because he came closest to our idea of the classic military commander." And Colonel General Heinz Guderian said, during his interrogation by the Allies in 1945, "I have heard a lot about General Patton. He conducted a good campaign, in my view. As a tank man, I have to congratulate him on his victory, because he acted just as I would have if I had been in his place." Even the renowned Nazi weekly newspaper Das Reich, which was later edited by future federal president Theodor Heuss, or the head of the Allensbach Polling Institute, Mrs. Nuala Neumann, had. In 1943, she dedicated a humorous article to Patton, in which his quirks were also discussed. With all this, it should not be overlooked that the United States Army in World War II produced only a few top tank generals at the divisional level, whereas the Wehrmacht had dozens of them. Therefore, Patton would probably have only been rated as above average in this group. Patton was a devout Christian who, like Frederick the Great and Napoleon, repeatedly saw luck or fortune as an essential part of a commander's personality. But the general, who always wore either a .45 long Colt single-action revolver or a .357 Magnum Smith & Wesson revolver on his belt, was also said by officers on his staff to have had an almost uncanny ability to be in the right place at the right time, or to have an instinctive sense of knowing, for example, when an enemy offensive might be about to happen. In general, it is more than likely that he would have driven the Wehrmacht out of France much faster, and probably would have defeated the already weakened units in Germany more quickly as well. If he had been in overall command of the American forces, and not the slow and cautious Omar Bradley, his former subordinate. Or even better, if Patton had become the supreme commander of the Allied forces in northwestern Europe on December 24, 1943, and not four-star General Eisenhower. Whether Patton would have continued marching toward Berlin in 1945 and not done as the United States Army did. He had stopped at the Elbe on April 25 and had left half of Europe to the Soviet Union. It's speculation, because that was the political decision of the United States government. But as for any higher position for him than that of a commander-in-chief, that was settled by August 1943 at the latest. When the general slapped two American soldiers suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder during the Sicily campaign and threatened army doctors with a drawn pistol. So, he was promoted to four-star general on April 14th, became military governor of occupied Bavaria on May 9th, 1945. But even in this position, he was now without war and without an army. He repeatedly attracted negative attention at the top through provocative, positive remarks about the former German enemy and negative ones about the Red Army, or the so-called displaced persons of Jewish faith. When Patton then told American reporters on September 22, 1945, that he did not see the necessity, quote, of this denazification thing, and when he compared the controversies about National Socialism to an election campaign between the Democrats and Republicans in the United States of America, High Commissioner Eisenhower transferred him to the 15th Army, which was stationed at the Grand Hotel in Bad Nauheim. However, this entire army consisted only of a miniature staff, which was supposed to contribute to the improvement of military tactics and operations by interviewing and researching participants of past battles, which Patton perceived as a humiliating disciplinary transfer. On the other hand, he had also written to his wife Beatrice, who was living in the United States, that he actually liked the new position better, as a quote, to be something like the executioner of the best race in Europe. However, his not very demanding duties in the 15th Army had also given him the opportunity to travel to France, Belgium, or Stockholm, where he had been honored with honorary citizenships and medals. But then he had decided to leave for Christmas vacation to the United States of America on December 12, 1945, where he wanted to talk with his wife Beatrice, whom he had been married to for 35 years and with whom he had 3 children. Should he even take up another military position in the United States of America at all, or would it be better to leave the army for good? His wife Beatrice had a half-sister, Louise Ayer Hathaway, married name Gordon, who had a daughter named Jean, born on February 4, 1915. And as you can read in the Patton biography by Carlo D'Este, published in 1995, the 50-year-old Patton, who was stationed in Honolulu, Hawaii in 1936, had an affair with the then 21-year-old Jean Gordon, who had visited the couple while passing through, and she was also the best friend of Patton's daughter, Ruth L. When Uncle George then visited a neighboring island with his half-niece for a few days to buy a horse, even his wife Beatrice, who was with him at a costume party in 1940, suspected something, that there was more going on between George and the attractive Jean than just innocent hand-holding. His infidelity almost destroyed his marriage with the devastated Beatrice, but George swore off Jean's kind of excitement, promised abstinence, and thus saved the marriage. But now, in May 1944, while General Patton was in Great Britain during the preparations for the invasion of Normandy, Jean, who was trained as a nurse, was also stationed in England as a Red Cross staff assistant. This immediately rekindled Beatrice's suspicions. At the beginning of July 1944, Jean contacted the general, and shortly before his departure to Normandy, he visited her in London. Later, he had practically confessed to his close friend on Eisenhower's staff, General Everett Judge, as Judge put it, rather boastfully than regretfully, that Jean had belonged to him for 12 years. If that were true, however, he would have been her lover since she was 17. After the successful invasion of Normandy, Jean was certainly not there by coincidence. She had been assigned to Clubmobile Group L of the American Red Cross at the headquarters of the Third Army in France as a so-called donut dolly. Clubmobile groups were a number of volunteer units equipped with buses, including, quote, many single, healthy, physically resilient, outgoing, and attractive women between 25 and 35 years old, deployed to provide troop support to soldiers with donuts, coffee, and cigarettes, and encouraged to entertain the soldiers with music, dancing, and conversation. Only a rogue would think badly of that. So, Jean became Patton's constant companion, and even acted as a sort of hostess when he received guests at his headquarters. But when Marlene Dietrich, who was also involved in entertaining United States troops, visited him in early November 1944, he later wrote grumpily in his diary, quote, had Marlene Dietrich and her troop for lunch, very poor comedy, almost an insult to human intelligence. He much preferred to repeatedly invite young women, so-called donut dollies, to dinners with his staff, even when superiors like General Eisenhower came to the headquarters of the Third Army. And the girls, in turn, had invited Patton to dinner several times. After the war, the young ladies became even more a part of his entourage. Shortly before, General Hughes visited Patton's headquarters in early May 1945. At least that's what he reported later. George and Jane had argued, but then reconciled and spent a vacation together in Great Britain. But then there was still Patton's wife, Beatrice. By then, she was convinced that her husband was back together with John, and had even asked him about it several times in letters. But he had categorically denied it. When Patton left for the United States in June 1945 for a month to promote more war bonds, he confessed to Everett Hughes the night before. He was terribly afraid of flying back to America, where his wife would be waiting for him. Hardly had George left when General Hughes brought the distraught Jean back to his apartment, quote, so she could cry her heart out there. When the 60-year-old Patton was back at his headquarters, Hughes confessed, Beatrice gave me hell. I'm glad to be back in Europe. Various historians have come up with the weirdest theories on this subject. One historian writes that the presence of Jean around Patton was merely intended to dispel the fears of a middle-aged man who was concerned about his masculinity. And another suggested that Patton, who was under heavy physical and psychological stress during the war, was merely boasting about sexual conquests. And Jean's superior, Betty South, even wanted to make the public believe this, probably to protect the reputation of both protagonists. It was exclusively a father-daughter relationship. In contrast, even Patton's daughter, Ruth Allen, speculated in her private notes that the romance between her father and her friend Jean had already begun in June 1934, which makes Patton's confession to General Hughes about his 12-year affair absolutely credible. In December 1945, John Gordon had returned to the United States on the passenger ship motorship Gripsholm. It was the month in which General Patton died on December 21st as a result of a car accident. Here is the picture of his funeral service at the Christ Church in Heidelberg, Weststadt, but hardly had Patton's widow, Beatrice, on the far right, next to Lieutenant General Jeffrey Keyes, who had fought under Patton. After returning to the United States of America following her husband's burial, she asked her brother Fred to arrange a meeting with Jean at a hotel in Boston. Neither Fred nor Jean had any idea why Patton's widow wanted this meeting. Although, given Beatrice's well-known jealousy, it should have been obvious to both of them. Later, Fred described the very brief meeting between the two women. Hardly had Beatrice entered the hotel room in silence when she looked angrily at John Gordon, pointed her finger at her, and uttered a kind of voodoo curse she had learned years ago in Hawaii. May the great worm gnaw at your organs, and may your bones rot away piece by piece. While John then visibly turned pale, he hurriedly left the room. It was never revealed what else happened in that hotel room. But a few days later, in the early morning hours of January 8, 1946, 30-year-old Jean Gordon was found dead in the kitchen of a friend's New York apartment. She had turned on all 4 gas burners on the kitchen stove and ended her life that way. Scattered around her were pictures of the beloved general. Back to Patton once more, to November 1945. From the 11th to the 26th of November, after Eisenhower left for the United States, where he was to be appointed Chief of Staff of the United States Army on the 19th, he became the interim commander of the United States Army in Europe. Then, back in the 15th Army, his Chief of Staff, Major General Hobart Gay, invited him to a pheasant hunt near Speyer on Sunday, December 9th. They had set out in 2 vehicles that morning. The weapons were on the bed of a jeep driven by Corporal Joseph Scrooge, according to other sources, Spruce, also Patton's dog Willie. The 2 generals sat in Patton's extra-long 1938 V8 Cadillac, driven by Patton's regular driver, 20-year-old Corporal Horace L. Woodring. Allegedly, fewer than 600 of this car model had been built. How it made its way to Europe is unknown. The general had probably used his connections. The drive in winter conditions, with good visibility and practically no other traffic on the road, went smoothly without any incidents. Near Bad Homburg, they visited the Saarburg, but because of the cold, they took Patton's dog from the Jeep and let it into the Cadillac. And then they continued driving until they reached Virenheim, where there was a checkpoint of the United States military police. Patton was sitting on the right side of the back seat, Gay on the left behind the driver. At a railroad crossing in Mannheim-Käfertal, here, the accident site today is Mannheimer Street at the corner of Neustadter Street, Woodring had to stop because of a train and noticed a General Motors Company Army truck parked in front of them on the other side. When Woodring started driving again, the 2.5-ton truck with a canvas-covered bed also began to roll forward slowly, roughly up to where the black car is standing. Then, at 11:48, as the 2 vehicles approached each other, the truck turned sharply to the left, directly in front of Patton's Cadillac, and the 2 vehicles collided at only a low speed, without Woodring having any chance to avoid the truck. But due to the lack of any crumple zones, the massive steel frame of the Cadillac transmitted the force of the impact directly inward. And since there were no seatbelts at that time, the generals sitting in the back were thrown forward and then back again. General Patton, however, who was leaning forward and turned halfway to the left at the time of the accident, hit his head against the metal partition between the front and back seats. After that, he fell back onto Gay, was unconscious for a moment, and was bleeding from a massive head wound. When Gay, who was unharmed, asked if the general was injured, Patton replied to him, "I think I'm paralyzed. I'm having trouble breathing." In fact, he had suffered a broken cervical vertebra with paralysis. Meanwhile, the driver Woodring had pulled Gay out from under Patton and made sure that help was called. The person responsible for the accident was the 20-year-old technical corporal Robert Thompson from Camden, New Jersey. According to the investigation files of the United States Military Police, the soldier from the 141st Armored Signal Company of the 1st Armored Division, stationed near Stuttgart, was fooling around drunk at the scene of the accident, and he apparently was proud of having crashed into the general's Cadillac. However, it was not reported why he was driving a truck more than 100 kilometers away from his unit on that Sunday morning. Either he had used the truck for private supply runs, or had gone for a morning joyride with his 2 passengers, who, however, are not named. A doctor and an ambulance arrived at the scene of the accident relatively quickly after the collision. However, this was before Patton arrived, despite the proximity of a hospital in Mannheim. Instead, he was taken to the 130th United States Garrison Hospital, now located in the former Signal Corps, barracks in Heidelberg-Rohrbach, where he was admitted at 12:45. There, a severe vertebral dislocation and a deep scalp wound were diagnosed, along with paralysis from the neck down. The best Army doctors from the 97th General Hospital in Frankfurt were immediately flown in. Additionally, on December 10th, the professor of neurosurgery at the University of Oxford, Dr. U. William Bell Cairns, was brought in. On December 12th, Beatrice Patton arrived, accompanied by the top United States neurologist, Dr. Roy Glenwood Sperling. However, he couldn't do much more than the 14 other doctors who were taking care of Patton. After several medical ups and downs, it was surprisingly on December the 17th that the general was doing so well that on the 19th it was decided to fly him to the United States despite his paralysis. But just as quickly as his condition had improved, it had now worsened again. After Patton complained of breathing difficulties on December 20th, an X-ray confirmed a blood clot in his right lung. Then on the afternoon of December 21st, he whispered to Beatrice, "It is too dark. I cry too late." A little later, at 5:55 p.m., General George S. Patton passed away in his sleep from injuries that could have been prevented with a simple seatbelt. He was then, according to his previously expressed wishes, buried on December 24th at the American Military Cemetery in Luxembourg, among the soldiers of his 3rd United States Army, who had fallen during the defense against the German Ardennes offensive. His wife Beatrice followed him on September 30, 1953, at the age of 67. His constant companion since March 4, 1944 was his dog Willie, who had originally belonged to a downed Royal Air Force pilot. After the burial, Willie was taken by the general's former personal assistant, Colonel Charles Russell Codman, along with the general's personal belongings, to the Patton family farm in California, where Willie lived for almost 12 more years. For 30 years, no one had doubted that it was an unfortunate and accidental incident to which General Patton had fallen victim. But since the mid-70s, witnesses have repeatedly come forward, journalists and writers, but also former United States intelligence agents, who, mainly for financial reasons, have turned the accident into an assassination. Most recently, the 2 journalists Bill O'Reilly and Martin Dugard published a book in 2014 in which they wrote, "The former CIA agent Douglas DeWitt Basada confessed at a conference in October 1979 that he had not only planned Patton's assassination, but had also been involved in it. He fired a heavy, slow-moving projectile through the open window of the Cadillac at Patton's neck in order to break the general's neck. But since Patton survived and did not die in the hospital, Soviet People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs agents murdered him in the hospital with an odorless poison." For his involvement in Patton's death, Basada received $10,000 from the head of the Army's intelligence service, the Office of Strategic Services, William Joseph Donovan. Despite this tall tale, anyone who looks into the circumstances of the accident can see that it wasn't even an unusual accident. And least of all, was it a murder, an assassination, or a conspiracy? It is undeniable that Patton had enemies who must have seen his death as a gift from heaven. But how could an assassin have known when, how, and where Patton would go hunting? And why so complicated? With a staged accident, where, for example, Gay or the driver could have died and Patton would have survived. A shot from a sniper rifle with a silencer would have been much safer and would have given the perpetrator or perpetrators a chance to escape. Or with a car bomb detonated electrically. And what if the hunting group had stayed in the Saalburg for 5 more minutes? How would the assassination disguised as an accident have been arranged then? Finally, the question of why General Patton should have been murdered. What would have been the motive? The fact is that he was basically washed up and so controversial that a venture into politics would certainly not have been successful. Because after wars are won, soldiers are always compensated with colorful medals, only to end up forgotten in their barracks again. And even if George Patton had given up his military privileges and his pension, which he was entitled to even after leaving the service, in order to appear more carefree, his behavior was said to be very rustic. The Italian slapping incident, his rash and politically more than incorrect remarks about Germans, Russians, and Jews. And finally, the long-standing affair of the married officer and gentleman with the much younger woman. Jean would have been successfully used against him by his competitors and opponents in the military and politics. Admittedly, General Eisenhower also had his assigned English driver, Kay Summersby, from May 1942. Until the end of the war, she was his girlfriend, who later became his secretary, and, with his help, became an American citizen, and, in 1947, a captain in the United States Women's Army Corps. But, unlike the vain, blustering, and hot-tempered Patton, Eisenhower's prestige was so impeccable that no journalist would have dared to make public any private missteps of the highest-ranking general of the United States of America, and from 1953 United States President. So, if you look at General Patton's accidental death objectively, the only conclusion is that he was killed by the injuries from an unfortunately occurring traffic accident. And with his unspectacular death for a successful general, he is not alone in history. Most great military leaders from ancient times to today did not die on the battlefield, but often at an old age, peacefully and in their own beds.